A very warm welcome to this week's study of the Book of Psalms. Today, as a slight exception to the normality, we will review two Psalms, respectively 42 and 43, which, as we shall discover, are in effect the same psalm broken into two pieces. May our thoughts and our words and our deeds be forever acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Psalms 42 and 43. As a deer longs for streams of water, so I long for you, O God. I thirst for God, for the living God. I say, when will I be able to go and appear in God's presence? I cannot eat, I weep day and night. All day long they say to me, where is your God? I will remember and weep, for I was once walking along with the great throng to the temple of God, shouting and giving thanks along with the crowd as we celebrated the holy festival. Why are you depressed, O my soul? Why are you upset? Wait for God. For I will again give thanks to my God for his saving intervention. I am depressed, so I will pray to you while in the region of the upper Jordan, from Hermon to Mount Mizar. One deep stream calls out to another at the sound of your waterfalls. All your billows and waves overwhelm me. By day the Lord decrees his loyal love, and by night he gives me a song, a prayer to the God of my life. I will pray to God, my high ridge. Why do you ignore me? Why must I walk around mourning because my enemies oppress me? My enemies' taunts cut into me to the bone, as they say to me all day long, where is your God? Why are you depressed, O my soul? Why are you upset? Wait for God, for I will again give thanks to my God for his saving intervention. Vindicate me, O God, fight for me against an ungodly nation. Deliver me from deceitful and evil men, for you are the God who shelters me. Why do you reject me? Why must I walk around mourning because my enemies oppress me? Reveal your light and your faithfulness. They will lead me, they will escort me back to your holy hill, to the place where you live. Then I will go to the altar of God, to the God who gives me ecstatic joy, so that I express my thanks to you, O God, my God, with the harp. Why are you depressed, O my soul? Why are you upset? Wait for God, for I will again give thanks to my God for his saving intervention. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The second part of the Psalter is characterized by the use of the divine name Elohim instead of Jehovah. And it begins with a cluster of 7 psalms, if we count Psalms 42 and 43 as one, of which the superscription is most probably regarded as ascribing their authorship to the sons of Korach. These were Levites and the office keepers of the door of the sanctuary, which had been hereditary in their family since the time of Moses. Some of them were to be found amongst the faithful followers of David at Ziklag, and in the new model of worship inaugurated by him, the Korachites were the doorkeepers and also the musicians. They were to retain the former office in the Second Temple, as we read in Nehemiah chapter 11. The ascription of the authorship of these psalms to a group is quite remarkable. And this in turn has led to suggestions that the superscription does not specify the authors, but the persons for whose use the psalms in question were composed. The original Hebrew text suggests either meaning, but if the latter meaning is adopted, the psalms are anonymous. The actual author, as one of a band of kinsmen who worked and sang together, would not, unnaturally, be content to sing his individuality and let his song go forth as that of the band. Clearly, the superscriptions rested upon some tradition or knowledge, else defective information would not have been acknowledged as it is in this one, but some name would have been made to fill the gap. These two psalms, 42 and 3, are plainly one, and the absence of a title for the second, and the identity of the tone throughout, the recurrence of phrases, and especially the refrain, surely put this beyond any reasonable doubt. There is perhaps evidence in these psalms favouring the hypothesis that the author was a Korachite companion of David's in his flight before Absalom. But the locality described as that of the singer does not entirely correspond to that of the king's retreat, and the description of the enemies is not easily capable of application in all points to these foes. The house of God still stands. The poet has been there recently and hopes soon to return and render praise. Therefore the psalm must be pre-exilic, and while there is no certainty attainable as to the date, it can at least be said that the circumstances of the singer present more points of contact with those of the supposed Korachite followers of David's fortunes on the uplands across the Jordan, than with those of any other imaginary persons to whom modern criticism has assigned the poem. Whoever wrote it has given immortal form to the longings of the soul after God. He has fixed forever and made melodious a sigh. Our psalm falls into three parts, each closing with the same refrain. Longings and tears, remembrances of festivals in the past, in the sanctuary melt the singer's soul, while taunting enemies hiss continual sarcasms at him as forsaken by his God. But his truest self, the silences that these lamentations produce, and the cheers for the feebler soul, with clear notes of trust and hope, blown in the refrain like some trumpet clang, or rallying dispirited fugitives to the fight. The stimulus serves us for a moment, but once more courage fails, and once more at yet greater length and with yet sadder tones, plaints and longings wail forth. Once more, too, the higher self repeats its half rebuke, half encouragement. And so ends the first of the psalm, but obviously it is no real ending, for the victory over fear is not yet won, and longing has not become blessed. So once more the wave of emotion rolls over the psalmist, but with a new aspect which makes all the difference. For now he prays. He had only remembered and complained in the past, and said that he would pray before. Therefore now he triumphs, and though he is still keenly conscious of his enemies, they appear but for a moment, and though he still feels that he is far from the sanctuary, his heart goes out in hopeful visions of the gladness of his return hither. He already tastes the rapture of the joy which will flood his heart. Therefore, when the refrain comes for a third time, this time the longing, trembling soul continues at the height to which the better self has lifted it, and silently acknowledges that it need not have been cast down in the first place. In this way, the whole song is a picture of a soul climbing, but not without backward slips, from the depths to the heights, or in another way, of the transformation of longing into the certainty of fruition. Perhaps the singer had seen, during his exile on the eastern side of Jordan, some gentle creature with open mouth and heaving flanks, eagerly seeking in dry waddies for a drop of water to cool her outstretched tongue, and the sight had struck on his heart as an image of himself longing for the presence of God in the sanctuary. A similar bit of local colour is generally recognised in verse 7 of Psalm 42. Nature reflects the poet's moods, and overmastering emotion sees its own analogues everywhere. That lovely metaphor has touched the common heart as few have done, and the solitary singer's plaint has fitted all devout lips. Injustice is done to it, if it is regarded merely as the longing of a Levite for approach to the sanctuary. No doubt the psalmist connected communion with God and the presence in the temple more closely together than they should do who have heard the great charter, neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem. But, however the two things were coupled in his mind, they were sufficiently separate to allow of approach by longing and prayer, while still distant in body. And the true object of yearning was not access to the temple, but communion with God in the temple. In Hebrew, the soul is a feminine noun, and here it is compared to the female deer, as pants is the feminine form of the verb, even though its noun is masculine. It is, therefore, perhaps better to translate hind rather than heart. The soul is the seat of emotions and desires. It pants and thirsts, is cast down and disquieted. It is poured out, but it can be bidden to hope. And tremulous, timid, mobile, it is beautifully compared to a hind. The true object of its longings is always God, however little it knows of what it is thirsting for. But they are happy in their yearnings who are conscious of the true direction of these, and can say that it is God for whom they are athirst. All unrest of longing, all fever of thirst, all the outpourings of desire are feelers put out blindly, and are only stifled when they can clasp it to him. The correspondence between a man's needs and their true object is involved in the name the living God, for a heart can only rest in one all-sufficient person, and must have a heart to throb against. Neither abstractions nor dead things can still its cravings. That which does must be alive, but no finite being can still them, and after all the sweetnesses of human loves and helps of human strengths, the soul's thirst remains unslaked, and the person who is enough must be the living God. The difference between a devout and a worldly man is just that one can only say, "My soul pants and thirsts," and the other can add, "After you, O God." This man's longing was intensified by his unwilling exile from the sanctuary, a special privation to a doorkeeper of the temple. His situation and mood closely resemble those in another Korachite psalm, 84, in which, as here, the soul faints for the courts of the Lord. And here, as the panting hind, so there the glancing swallows, flitting about the eaves, are woven into the song. Unnamed foes taunt the psalmist with the question, "Where is your God?" There is no necessity to conclude that these were heathens, although the taunt is usually put into heathen lips. but it would be quite as natural from fellow religionists, flouting his fervour and personal grasp of God, and taking his sorrows as a token of God's abandonment of him. For that is the world's way with the calamities of a devout man, whose humble cry, "My God," it resents as a presumption or a hypocrisy. But even these bitter sarcasms are less bitter than the remembrance of happier things, which is the sorrow's crown of sorrow. And yet, with the strange but universal love of summoning up remembrance of departed joys, the psalmist finds pleasure in the pain of recalling how he, a Levite, led the festive march to the temple, and in listening in fancy again to the shrill cries of joy which broke from the tumultuous crowd. The form of the verbs remember and pour out in verse 4 indicates a purpose. The higher self arrests this flow of self-pity and lamentation. The feminine soul has to give an account of her mood to calmer judgment and to be lifted and steadied by the stronger spirit. The preceding verses have given ample reason why she has been feeling dejected, but now she is summoned to repeat them to a judicial ear. The insufficiency of the circumstances described to warrant the vehement emotions expressed is implied in the summons. Feeling has to vindicate its rationality or to be quiet, and its grounds have often only to be stated to the better self, to be found altogether disproportionate to the storm they are raising. It is very elementary, but a necessary lesson for the conduct of life, that emotion of all sorts, glad or sad, religious or other, needs good rigid scrutiny and firm control, sometimes stimulating and sometimes dampening down. The true counterpoint to its excess lies in directing it to God and in making him the object of our hope and our patient waiting. Emotion varies, but God remains the same. The facts on which faith feeds abide while faith fluctuates. The secret of calm is to dwell in that inner chamber of the secret place of the Most High, which whoso inhabits hears not the loud cold winds when they call, and is neither dejected nor uplifted, neither disturbed by excessive joys, nor torn apart by his anxieties. Verse 5 of Psalm 42 has the refrain in a slightly different form from the other two instances, but perhaps the text is merely in error. Now, the shifting of the word of verse 6 to the end of verse 5 and the substitution of my for his bring the three refrains into line and avoid the harsh expression help of his countenance. Since no reason for this variation can be determined, and the proposed slight change of text improves construction and restores uniformity, we should perhaps adopt it. If it is, the second part of the psalm also conforms with the other two, in regard with it not beginning with the divine name. Our break in the clouds at this point is but momentary, and the grey dreich fills the sky once more. The second part of the psalm takes up the question of the refrain, and first reiterates with bitter emphasis that the soul is bowed down, and then it pours out once more the stream of reasons for the dejection. But the curb has not been applied quite in vain, for throughout the succeeding verses there is a striking alternation of despondency and hope. Streaks of light flash through the gloom. Sorrow is shot with trust. This conflict of opposite emotions is the characteristic of the second part of the psalm, while that of the first part is an all but unrelieved predominance of gloom, and that of the third an all but undisputed victory of the sun. Naturally, this transition is marked by the mingling of both. In the former part, memory was the handmaiden of sorrow and came involuntarily, increasing the singer's pain. But in our next part, he makes an effort of will to remember, and in remembering finds the antidote to sorrow. To recall past joys adds sting to present grief, but to remember God brings an anodyne for the smart. The psalmist is far from the sanctuary, but distance does not hinder memories. This man's faith was not so dependent on externals that he could not come close to God, while distant from his temple. It had been so far strengthened by the encouragement of the refrain that the reflux of sadness at once rouses it to action. If my soul is cast down, let me remember you. With wise resolve he finds in dejection a reason for nestling closer to God. We might say, in reference to the description of the psalmist's locality, the preposition from is chosen rather than in, for a subtle purpose. It suggests that the psalmist's faith will bridge over the gap between himself and the sanctuary. I can send my thoughts to you from the distant frontier. The region intended seems to be the northeastern corner of Palestine, near to the lower slopes of Hermon. We have in the Hebrew here the word Hermon in the plural, which is probably used in reference to a group of peaks of the same mountain ridge. Mizar is perhaps the name of a hill otherwise unknown, or maybe even the name of one of these crests, and specifies the singer's locality more minutely, even though it may not particularly be helpful to us today. Many ingenious attempts have been made over the centuries to explain the name either as symbolical or as a common noun and not a proper name. But it is unuseful to think about these. The locality thus identified is too far north for the scene of David's retreat from Absalom, unless we give an unusually southward extension to their names. And this makes difficulty in the way of accepting the hypothesis of the authors having been in his retinue. The twofold emotions of verse 6 recur in 7 and 8, where we have first renewed despondency and then reaction into hope. The imagery of floods lifting up their voices and the cataracts sounding as they fall, breaking waves rolling over the half-drowned psalmist, has been supposed to be suggested by the scenery in which he was. But the rushing noise of Jordan in its rocky bed seems scarcely enough to be described as the flood calling to flood, and the breakers and rollers is an exaggeration, if applied to any commotion possible in such a stream. The imagery is so usual that it needs no assumption of having been occasioned by the poet's locality. The psalmist paints his calamities as storming upon him in dismal continuity, each flood seeming to summon its successor. They rush upon him, multitudinous and following each other closely. They pour down on him as with the thunder of descending cataracts, overwhelming him like the breakers and rollers of an angry ocean. These bold metaphors are more striking when contrasted with the opposite ones of the first part. There we have dry and thirsty land. Here the rush of waters mean the same thing. So flexible is nature in a poet's hand. And then we have a gleam of hope. Like a rainbow spanning the waterfall, with the alternation of mood already noticed as characteristic, the singer looks forward, even from the midst of the overwhelming sea of trouble, to a future day when God will give his angel mercy or loving kindness, charge concerning him, and draw him out of these swirling waters. That day of rescue will surely be followed by a night of music and thankful prayer. For supplication is not the only element in prayer. To the one who, by his deliverance, has shown himself to be the God of the rescued man's life. The epithet answers to that of the former part, the living God, from whom it differs but by one additional letter. He who has life in himself is the giver and rescuer of our lives, and to him they are to be rendered in thankful sacrifice. And once more the contending currents meet in verses 9 and 10, in the former of which confidence and hope utter themselves in the resolve to appeal to God, and in the name given to him as my rock, a strong place in the flood. And while another surge of despondency breaks in the question in which the soul interrogates God, as the better self had interrogated her, and contrasts almost reproachfully God's apparent forgetfulness, shown by his delay in delivering with her remembrance of him. It is not a question asked for enlightenment's sake, but is merely an exclamation of impatience, if not of rebuke. Verse 10 repeats the enemy's taunt, which is there represented as like a crushing blow which broke the bones. And then once more, above this conflict of emotion, soars the clear note of the refrain, summoning to self-command, calmness and unfaltering hope. But our victory is not yet quite won, and therefore we have the 5 verses of Psalm 43 to follow. It is sufficiently distinct in tone to explain its separation from the preceding, insomuch as it is a prayer throughout, and the note of joy is dominant, whilst at the same time there is an undertone of sadness which links it with the 2 previous parts. This unity is compounded by the considerations already noted and by the incompleteness of Psalm 42, without the triumphant close, and of Psalm 43 without the despondency of the beginning. And the first 2 verses blend the 2 elements, which were at war in the second part, and for the moment the darker is the more prominent. The situation is described as in the preceding parts. The enemy is called a loveless nation, and the word rendered loveless is compounded of the negative prefix and the word which is usually found with the meaning of one whom God favours or visits with loving kindness. It has been disputed whether its proper meaning is active, one who shows loving kindness, or passive, one who receives it. But considering that loving kindness is in the Psalter mainly a divine attribute, and that's when a human excellence, it is regarded as derived from and being the echo of experienced divine mercy, it is surely best to give it the passive meaning, as the principle, though sometimes as unmistakably here the active, is more suitable. These loveless people are not further defined, and may either have been Israelites or aliens. Perhaps there was one man of particular mischief prominent among them, but it is not safe perhaps to treat that expression as anything but a collective. But the gloomier mood has shot its last bolt. Grief, which finds no fresh words, is beginning to dry up. The stage of mechanical repetition of complaints is not far from ending, and so the higher mood conquers finally, and breaks into a burst of joyous petition, which passes swiftly into realization of the future joys whose coming shines thus far off. Hope and trust win the field. The certainty of return to the temple overbears the pain of absence, and the vivid realization of the gladness of worshipping again at the altar takes the place of the vivid and painful remembrance of the former festal approach. It is the prerogative of faith to make pictures drawn by memory pale beside those painted by hope. Light and truth, loving kindness and faithfulness in fulfilling promises are like two angels dispatched from the presence of God to guide with gentleness the exile's steps. That is to say, because God is mercy and faithfulness, the return of the psalmist to the home of his heart is guaranteed. God being what he is, no longing soul can ever remain unsatisfied. The actual return to the temple is desired because thereby new praise will be occasioned. Not mere bodily presence, but the joyful outpouring of triumph and gladness is the object of the psalmist's longing. He began by yearning for the living God. In his sorrow he could still think of him as the help of his countenance and call him my God. He ends with naming him the gladness of my joy. Whoever begins as he did will finish where he ended. The refrain is repeated for the third time, being followed by no relapse into sadness. The effort of faith should be persistent, even if the old enemy's bitternesses begin again and break the low beginnings of content. For even if the wild waters burst through the dam once, again and again, they do not utterly wash it away, and there remains a foundation on which may be built up anew. Each swing of the gymnast lifts him higher until he is once on a level with a firm platform from which he can spring and stand secure. Faith may be for us a long struggle against fear, but it will have the last word, and that word will be the help of my countenance and my God. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.